Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Cattie Gonzalez webcast titled WCMSA Mandatory Reporting. This demands a webinar. My name is John Cattie. I'm the managing partner of Cattie Gonzalez. On behalf of the firm, welcome. We greatly appreciate your interest and your attention and your willingness to join us today and learn a little bit about this CMS technical alert as it relates to certain mandatory insurer reporting obligations and TPOC reports, and downstream from that, how it affects workers' comp, Medicare set-asides. We're going to go for 60 minutes today, and the goal here is for us to use this as a launching pad for quarterly firm webcasts and webinars about a variety of topics. And we'll start today with this workers' comp MSA mandatory reporting that's going on. To join me today are my law partners, Cattie Gonzalez and Jim Anderson. Raphael, how are we doing today?
I am doing great, John. It's a beautiful day down here in Florida. 80-something degrees already down here, so we're good. How about you guys?
We have temperatures here in the Austin area in the upper 80s as well. I think this will be the highest temperature of the year so far today. So I'm glad to be inside where the air conditioning is working well.
And here in Charlotte, we're above 70. Weather's nice. I'm not exactly sure that we got a winter here in Charlotte this year, but certainly looking forward to warmer days and sunny temperatures here going forward, guys. So let's get started here. Let's talk about what we're going to be talking about today for the next 60 minutes. Here's our agenda for this session, everybody. We're going to first start and talk about how did we get here? You know, this has been a long and winding road when it comes to workers' compensation, Medicare set-asides, mandatory insurer reporting, and all the different iterations and user guides and reference guides and policy memos over a generation now in this space. So we want to talk about the road that got us here. Just to tee off what has happened as of the November 13th webinar from CMS, as well as the February 23rd technical alert that was issued regarding this work comp MSA reporting development. We will then talk through systematically the required and voluntary work comp MSA data fields and details that CMS will be collecting. From there, we'll go one by one, granularly speaking, about the data fields as we go. Then we'll talk about the error codes that may be generated based on the data submitted erroneously. And then that'll take up about the first half of our presentation. The second half of the presentation is going to be questions and comments and conjecture to a certain extent from this panel. We'll be fielding and answering your questions as soon as we get the chat feature enabled. And then we'll wrap things up at the end of the hour, sharing with you what we believe are going to be best practices and recommendations from lawyers who practice Medicare secondary payer law, what we're going to be talking about and sharing with our clients regarding recommendations how to report compliantly, and then what that's going to mean with respect to work comp MSAs going forward in that kind of way. So Cattie Gonzalez, esteemed Medicare secondary payer attorney and industry expert, how exactly did we get here?
John, you've been a part of this process for a long time. Jim, I know through your 50 years of practice in workers' compensation, you've also been down this road. A lot of us have been thinking about this issue, right? When would Medicare seek information, ask about, maybe even as now this alert tells us, require specific information about the workers' compensation Medicare set-asides, whether introduced and provided to CMS for their review and approval, or even those that aren't sent over to CMS for their review and approval. A lot of us have had this conversation with CMS officials over the years. A lot of us have asked questions of multiple individuals at CMS about this particular area. So I don't think it's a surprise, right, for all of us who've been knee-deep into Medicare secondary payer, into workers' comp MSAs for a long time. But certainly, John, I think we can, first time ever that we had something concrete in writing, right, is that November 13th, 2023 webinar. CMS announced it first, and then they held the webinar. And I think, John, on the next slide, we've got a website, for folks if they want to download it themselves. Right, we've got some information there where you can grab for yourself, PDF of it. The information that CMS leadership shared with our industry regarding what was then on November 13th, their plan to announce a formal process where CMS was going to require specific data, specific information from the RREs on comp MSAs, whether or not they met the review thresholds, whether or not they were submitted to CMS for review. So that, John, I think was the beginning of this conversation. For those of us in it, right, we've been having these conversations for a long while, but this was, I think, the first time where Medicare put it on the table. Medicare gave it to the industry as a whole, and I think very openly, very honestly, told everybody this is what we're going to do. And sure enough, this technical alert in February of 2024 has delivered kind of the technical details of that announcement back on November 13th.
Jim, you have a unique perspective amongst the three of us, as you joined as a partner approximately a year ago after a long and illustrious career as a workers' comp defense attorney. Historically speaking, when it came to work comp MSAs, what was your perspective, and what was generally the guidance that you were providing your clients with respect to these types of issues?
Well, to be perfectly honest, until I joined you guys, I thought that uh, MSA had been misspelled when you kept talking about the MSP environment. Because in our world, the only thing we knew about the MSP, Medicare Secondary Payer world, was an MSA. And so that's what we focused on. We had no input, no focus of any kind on the reporting requirements. And the conditional payment liens that came up on the backside were also something that we were rarely involved in. And it generally went to the plaintiffs' counsel to deal with those issues. So I am very glad to have an opportunity to be talking about the fact that the MSP world is more than an MSA. Those of you who've heard me speak so far on this topic, that's been what I've talked about, because there's so much more to this area of the law than simply the preparation of an MSA or a decision to ignore that entirely. So I think that we're on the right path of helping find some solutions there. And as we go forward, we'll talk more about those points that we think the council need to be involved in, be paying attention to, because it is so significantly important to get it right. This newest development that we're talking about here today just indicates the fact that we need to pay attention to more than we have paid to in the past. Can we sneak this one by without worrying about an MSA is not the answer to the question. Requires a little more diligence than been given to it in the past.
Jim, as time has gone on and we've been learning more and receiving more information from CMS about Medicare set-asides in workers' compensation cases, about mandatory insurer reporting when it comes to either ORM reports or TPOC reports over the past decade, and conditional payments and the developments we've seen with respect to the addition of the CRC about 8 years ago. We know that these three separate and distinct obligations are all interconnected and woven. And this, for me, and we'll talk a bit more in detail about this later in the hour, for me, this is tightening the web with respect to all three of these obligations touching each other in a more intimate fashion, because you've got to get each of these three pieces correct in order to be truly MSP compliant. And where in the past, certain parties would perhaps take a path and make decisions with respect to the MSA issue, thinking that we have a voluntary process for review and approval of MSAs based on certain workload review thresholds. Well, as long as we aren't settling a claim for something that reaches this threshold, that we can perhaps stay off of the radar and handle things in a manner that we see fit, that may or may not be agreeable in DC and in Baltimore, Maryland. So, Ralph, let's move from November 13th to the technical alert itself. February 23rd. This is really hot off the press, right?
It is just a few days ago, right? Delivered to us with, I think, very purposeful in mind. It does provide that first page will provide you with, the technical authority, the statutory authority that CMS has in order to be able to do this and the rationale why they're doing this. And John, you've already, I think, more than hinted at it, right? A lot of folks, I think, over the years has sort of assumed, mandatory reporting very much tied to the conditional payments, figuring out who's there, who owes it, right? And the information that's significant to be able to figure out the details of that conditional payment. A lot of folks never ever tied mandatory reporting with Medicare set-asides. That was sort of left out there in another world, as Jim has indicated, right? And folks never put two and two together. This technical alert, John, does that, right? It most absolutely, concretely brings together the mandatory insurer reporting component and the technical aspects that we'll talk about here and the Medicare set-aside. It takes it maybe further than some folks ever thought possible, meaning, where CMS has had this process of sending them up to CMS, reviewing them. Even those files that don't go through that process will now be made part of this mandatory insurer reporting process of providing CMS a few details of that workers' comp MSA. So, like you said, John, bringing it all together, right? Bringing it all in, making it all one big component, one big part of the MSP compliance world.
At the end of the day, the goal here is coordination of benefits. It's to make sure that the Medicare program is paying bills appropriately for beneficiaries. And when there are other folks who are responsible for medical expenses, it shouldn't be the Medicare program, it shouldn't be the taxpayer footing the bill. It ought to be the responsible party who is the appropriate primary plan or payer under those circumstances. Couple significant things from my perspective before we get into the details of the alert, guys. Number one, this is work comp specific. All workers' compensation. We're not talking about anything else outside of that today with respect to this technical alert. Okay. It's very clear with what has been provided that this is limited to workers' compensation claims. And it's not being put into practice immediately. It's an effective date of April 4th of 2025. We have 13 months as an industry and as practitioners to review this, examine it, get our head around it, get our head around how this one development may affect mandatory insurer reporting, conditional pay, and set-asides, and to work to develop compliant protocols and procedures so that folks can very easily comply with these provisions and not have to worry about being out of step. So those, from a high level, I think that's important for us to say before we dive into the details of this.
Good point, John. And I think valuable to everybody out there who is, right, reporting right now, October 7th, right, we're going to be allowed to sort of play, experiment, if you will, with this new system, right? So those folks that want to carry out sort of experimentationally here for a while, reporting this data over to CMS, this process will be made available in early October of this year, up until the running of when it becomes official and becomes required in April of 2025.
So let's get into the nitty gritty here. Ralph, what exactly are we reporting to Medicare?
John, there are 5 different components, and you see them up here, that based on this new technical alert will be required reporting details, right? So these 5 key pieces of information will be required as part of this new workers' comp MSA reporting process. And they make absolute sense, right? We're talking about the MSA amount. We're talking about the number of years that this MSA will be good for. Medicare clearly wants to know whether this is being funded lump sum or it's being funded structured. If it is being funded through a structured annuity, they want to know what that initial deposit amount, and they want to know the anniversary annual deposit amount. Certainly, for all of us who have been dealing with workers' comp MSAs for a while, these 5 key pieces of information are, you will have been a part of the system and the process since the very beginning. They make quite a bit of sense to all of us engaged or involved in that. There are 2 pieces of information that Medicare has decided to make voluntary as part of this reporting process, and that is if the parties have submitted their workers' comp MSA to CMS for their review and approval. So if they've taken advantage of that process, they do want the case control number. Again, completely voluntary. Since it is a voluntary process to send it up to CMS, the reporting of that information here also voluntary, if you will. If there is a professional administrator in place, Medicare has also asked for that voluntary information, the tax ID of that particular professional administrator. Certainly that administrator has to be registered with CMS in order for that number to coincide. If there is no administrator present, or if that administrator hasn't registered with CMS, then the fallback would be that the administrator of that MSA is the claimant, is the Medicare beneficiary. So both of these components, voluntary, the other 5 required. So John, not to get super deep into all of this, right? Because clearly the technical alert provides you with that, and I'm sure we're going to get more from CMS over the next year on this. But just want to give folks a little bit of a flavor for what exactly these pieces of information, these fields are going to require. So we're going to report this information in fields 37, 38, 39, 40, 41. Those are the required ones. And then fields 42 and 43 for those 2 that are voluntary. This first one, the amount of the MSA will be reported in field 37. And as you can see there, all numeric value that will be reported to CMS. It's a size 11 different digits, right? And it's a required if the TPOC amount is greater than $0. So in any case where you settled for more than 0, so yep, folks, just as I think we mentioned earlier, even in cases that fall below the review thresholds. So I think over the years, we have sort of gotten used to thinking about MSAs only on those cases over 25 that go to CMS with a current Medicare beneficiary, or that go over 250,000. Here, in cases even with minimal settlements, if a current Medicare beneficiary are gonna be, and there is that reporting requirement here, Medicare wants to know that workers' comp MSA amount. So John, that's a difference, significant if you will, from where we've been all along, right?
It sure is, because we know that all along that the work comp MSA review process is a voluntary one, unless you're in a state such as Virginia or Maryland, where the state's workers' comp commission has certain internal guidelines with respect to that decision. So you've had organizations that have sometimes leaned into the voluntary review process. You have other organizations who have leaned away from it for certain reasons. Now you're going to have everything coming in so long as the TPOC amount is greater than 0 and the claim getting resolved involves a current Medicare beneficiary. Irregardless of whether the parties have gone through that review process with the WCRC. So you're going to have some files that are being reported to Medicare through the review process, getting an approved MSA, and we'll be submitting data here as part of the TPOC report. There's Those will both be going on certain cases. On other cases, the parties may not choose to tap the WCRC to review and approve their MSA. But still, if the claimant is a current Medicare beneficiary, certain information, as we're detailing here, will be reported to Medicare after settlement, judgment, or award through the TPOC report. So that's going to be a significant change going forward.
Jim, how do you think that changes workers' compensation practice from both the claimant and the defense perspective?
Well, when we were practicing and handling cases, we looked first at the workload thresholds that have been established. Is it of an amount high enough that we need to consider doing an MSA and submitting it to the CMS for approval? Or is it below the workload threshold? And if it's below the workload threshold, we generally agreed on something that would represent the future interests of Medicare. So this sounds as if it's going to be a game changer in how cases get handled, since those workload thresholds are no longer the dictating factor in whether or not an MSA is prepared. Is it your interpretation that an MSA calculation needs to be made on every case that's over $750 in total value?
That's the question, right? And how it changes the practice of folks who may have gotten used to thinking only about those thresholds previously, right? I think, and I agree with you, Jim, that the new landscape requires an explanation of this workers' comp MSA. Even if you're not going to settle this file for more than 25,000 or 250, even if you're not going to submit this case, if it settles over those thresholds, it now requires a deeper analysis of what that number really means and where is it coming from. Or maybe historically, folks were a little forgiving about those cases that didn't meet threshold. They generally, based on their experience, sized it up and provided a number within their settlement agreement. Those days might be over. This may require more than that, right? Knowing that this is a number that's going to get reported to CMS and that it may mean something to CMS and the parties a year or 2 or 5 or 10 down the line. What do you think about that?
That's what I was thinking as well. As a practitioner, I would want to advise clients, regardless of which side we were on, that we need to pay close attention to this detail and not just give it lip service. So I don't know that we can expect the CMS to automatically start enforcing an unapproved MSA that's below the thresholds that was reported, but eventually something will probably be done with that data. It'll be used in some fashion down the road. So I think that the better plan is to make sure that any numbers that we put in that report have some validity.
John, we've had some conversations amongst ourselves here about that issue, right? What will CMS do with this data? How will this data play out immediately in 2025 or 3, 5, whatever years down the road, right? We know from a historical perspective, CMS is great at collecting that data, slowly but surely accumulating and watching an industry do its thing, and then ultimately learn from what that data tells them and create policy according to those numbers and what that information tells them. So we can all probably speculate to some degree, where this data may end up at, or how CMS may use some of that data, considering where this MSA process has been from its origin to where it's at today. What are your thoughts on all of that, John? What's going on in your head about it?
Guys, data is a powerful thing, right? The ability to accumulate information in individual points of detail for one particular case or claim that's going to live in perpetuity on the common working file of that beneficiary, allowing Medicare to coordinate benefits to perhaps deny claims being received from providers, turning them around and say, nope, we shouldn't be paying this bill. You need to get your patient, the beneficiary, to pay that bill instead. Or paying the bill, but then, we made this payment in error. There's a responsible party out there. There's a primary payer here who we need to go seek reimbursement of this bill from. The ability on a one off claim basis is going to be a powerful thing. But imagine the cumulative effect of this over a number of years. I personally think that CMS is going to be very thoughtful and deliberate with respect to how they implement policy going forward once it's had a chance to review the data that's being collected, which is why, in my belief, we'll see things years down the road with respect to action that's being taken based on the data collected. We know that in the cumulative, CMS would have the ability to look at some of the common ties across beneficiaries resolving workers' comp claims and look to different states where certain practices might be in play. Look at different organizations who are paying on claims and what the data tells them with respect to them going forward. Jim, you mentioned the fact that as a practice, there were certain times where the parties resolving the comp claim may throw a certain amount of money at the MSA number without much rhyme or reason to how they're coming at that. For me, this ought to mean that those days are going to be in the past and that there's going to need to be some type of basis grounded in the law, the Medicare Secondary Payer Act, that justifies the number that's being put on field 37, right?
Exactly right. Exactly right. I do think that's one of the things that we will see evolve out of this pretty quickly, just because it's going to be so important to have a basis for understanding Medicare's future interests in those cases that don't meet the workload thresholds. I can see a couple of changes taking place among the practitioners. One of the things that we never focused on with any um, intensity concerned the ICD-9 and ICD-10 codes. Those were handled by the insurance company that paid the bills, and we didn't worry about any of that. I can see a concerted shift into focusing on the actual ICD-9 and 10 codes that are attached to a particular file by the practitioners. They need to know specifically what it is that is related to that claim and what is not related to that claim. We know from our conditional payment work that many times we get presented with liens from Medicare because things that were not a part of our claim had been paid by Medicare, but the person responsible for reporting the claim details to the CMS had not gotten the ICD-10 codes right. They may have paid for things that were not part of the claim, such as a back injury, and they pay for hypertension medication. And I can see a real intensive effort by the claimant's bar in saying, I want to know what you have reported to the CMS on behalf of my client so that we can make sure we don't have something come up down the road. And also to make sure that we know what we're actually trying to account to Medicare for related to its future interests as required by this new coding. So I think that's going to be one of the practice shifts that'll take place very quickly there. Uh, One of the things that generally wasn't done in our practice was to really hone in on what the docs are saying is a true future medical exposure. Many cases had none. And if you would just get the doctor to clarify in writing that this person has been treated and no further treatment is expected, it gives you a basis as a way to fill in that number is zero. You've got something to go on. And just writing down zero for the heck of it is not going to be a good way to go there. So I can see some more intense effort on the part of practitioners to deal with some of those issues up front. I think that we'll also see a move towards perhaps even including covered ICD-10 codes in the settlement documents. so that it is clear, yes, we settled this case, but this is all we settled because it's all that's related to the injury. And so that's another focus point I can see practitioners taking, another tactic to try to tie this down as best as possible under the circumstances. Trying to do it right will make all the difference in that reporting being quite easy.
Man, Jim, I love that last suggestion right there. I agree with you 100%. I have always thought that it makes all the sense in the world for the parties, not only on the comp side, but on the liability side too. But the parties are coming together, agreeing to what is going to be reported to CMS in that TPOC report, making that an exhibit to your release so that it's being memorialized. It's evident the parties have agreed. Here's the data that's going to go up to CMS. We agree on the ICD-10 codes. We're agreeing on the dates of injury and loss. We're agreeing on all these other granular details that CMS looks for with respect to the TPOC report that we know in the work that we do day in and day out, the issues that are caused by erroneous TPOC reporting that opens up additional files either at the CRC or the BCRC, creating needless work for everybody because of a misunderstanding up front. So I love that suggestion.
I do too. We've often said it to our clients, right? A recommendation that at your mediation, you make it part of that settlement agreement. Make sure everybody understands what are the things that are going to get reported to CMS, what are the right ICD-9s or 10s, Jim. You're absolutely right. Right. Let's go through these codes a little faster here so we can get to some meat at the end of this here. Field 38, there we're talking about the MSA period, right? The actual number of years that the MSA is expected to cover the beneficiary. And it's required if the MSA amount is zero. We're going to enter that zero all across if it's a zero there, but it's required for the number of years, right? 39, all about telling Medicare whether this is a lump sum or a structured payout. So there's now going to be an indicator as part of this new reporting mechanism that will tell Medicare whether it is an S for the structured or annuity, or whether it is an L, a lump sum. So that's going to be the new requirement to tell Medicare how this particular MSA is going to be funded.
Ralph, before you move to the next slide, let me point out that most of the time, if there wasn't an MSA involved that actually had to be presented from the practitioner standpoint, the possibility of a structured settlement was not even mentioned, wasn't a possibility. And I think that this reinforces the fact that there can very well be some structured settlements regarding Medicare's future interests, even if it's not one that has to be submitted to the CMS for approval or below their workload threshold.
You're right, Jim. Sometimes that gets overlooked, right? Especially in smaller settlements, right? There seems to be less of an interest in going down that road, but this may awaken that interest now that, you know, there is a mechanism to tell Medicare how all of this is happening. So you're absolutely right. 40, John, I think it's the initial deposit amount. So if the MSA is going to be funded by way of a structure or an annuity, Medicare wants to know the amount of that initial deposit. It is, again, all of these first five are required. And of course, the indicator must match, right? An S for structured. If it's an L, meaning it's going to get paid lump sum, then you can leave it all blanks. You can enter zero. So there's got to be an S in order for that number to be reportable there. 41 is the anniversary date, the annual deposit amount date. So again, if this MSA is going to be funded structured, in addition to providing that initial deposit, Medicare wants to know the anniversary date of each of these payments on an ongoing basis. Again, these are items that I think have been fairly stable, a part of the ongoing process in workers' comp MSAs for a long time. They are now going to be required as part of this new reporting mechanism to CMS. The last two, fields 42 and 43, as we've already indicated, both of these are not required. They're voluntary. And 42 is that case control number if the parties did in fact submit the MSA to CMS. If it is unknown, then you can sort of enter spaces and it'll be left alone. 43 is that professional administrator. If there is one, then CMS now wants to know the federal ID number of that professional administrator if one is in fact providing that service to the Medicare beneficiary. If it unknown, also enter all zeros. So John, these are sort of the, and folks that, make sure you look at it for yourself. Make sure, especially those of you who are, intimately engaged with reporting this type of information, those of you who do mandatory reporting every day, right? All of these new fields will be made part of the process. So all of us need to know and figure out exactly what is it that's going to be required, the number of digits made available to us, whether numeric or only numbers, those kinds of things. Because John, what's coming next, of course, are errors associated with these particular components, right? These new things. And as Medicare always does, they've been methodical about thinking through what could be the potential errors, the potential mistakes that folks could make when reporting this type of information. So they've given us a total, I think, of 12 different errors, right? And as you can see there, that first one is all numeric. So if you put letters in there, they're going to catch you. That's a mistake, right? Same thing with the second one. So as you'll go through them, simple enough to be able to explain, but thoughtful from CMS's already well-established procedure that whenever they require a certain type of information and you're not giving them that information, or if information that you reported earlier does not match with what's now being required here, that this process captures that, identifies it, and puts it out as an error to those folks that are reporting this information.
So Ralph, Jim, on its face, seems pretty simple, seems pretty cut and dry. We're just reporting a few more pieces of data to Medicare in this TPOC report, right? Should be a simple thing to comply with, especially given the fact that it's not coming online for another 13 months until April 4th of 25. But we know that there are already questions that have been generated by the industry around the workers' compensation world and have been getting asked since that November webinar, right? And we're hearing it more loudly as we are out and about, speaking at conferences, talking with clients, interacting with folks in sessions like this. And here are some of the questions that we've been getting asked and thought it'd be valuable to roundtable a little bit here during this session. First and foremost, you're always going to have that minority of the industry who are wondering, is probably a nice way to say it. Does CMS actually have the authority to make this change and include this MSA data in the TPOC? Guys, what do we think about that?
John, I think you introduced that concept early on when you introduced the seminar to everybody out here today. And that is that from a statutory perspective, and certainly after the MIR mandatory insurer reporting changes were adopted in the statute, B8 specifically addresses non-group health plans mandatory insurer reporting, and they absolutely make it clear that the secretary has the authority to, come up with these type of, information data gatherings with the purpose of making sure that there is coordination of benefits, which I think has been previously provided to us as the rationale behind these. So I think from a legal perspective, John, there is authority and there is a proper examination, explanation for the reason CMS wants this new data reported to them.
And Ralph, that's the key here, right? This is what we're talking about here is not a Medicare set aside MSA change. This is a change in the reporting. And 42 USC 1395 YB8 clearly allows the Secretary of Health and Human Services to collect data for the purposes of coordination of benefits. And certainly when you're thinking about that time period post settlement, judgment, or award on a workers' comp case, that is a time where coordination of benefits needs to be in high gear, right? When the claimant is still treating, medically speaking, for either accepted body parts, conditions, or injuries in the settlement, or denied body parts, conditions, or injuries in the settlement. There has been this gap here, and this is filling going to fill the gap nicely from a coordination of benefits perspective. So I agree. CMS absolutely has the authority under that statute to make these additional data points required reporting on the TPOC. From a punishment perspective, what's that look like? Especially thinking about the new civil monetary penalties that are coming online.
Oh, John, how dare you? The CMP word. Ooh. So at first glance, right, you have to ask, what if I don't report? I mean, after all, it's not ORM, whether yes or no. It's not a termination of ORM. It's not the amount of the TPOC. So at first glance, some folks were like, well, maybe there's nothing to look at here, right? But I think as CMS has explained further, right, that these civil monetary penalties with regard to the timeliness of that reporting also means that, hey, what's happened before doesn't go away, meaning if you don't report or you report things inconsistently, erroneously, that record is errored, and therefore that report doesn't essentially get met, right, with Medicare's guidelines. So you haven't answered the question. You haven't done what's required of you, which means you're not complying with this particular mandate, which means if you're not complying and you haven't checked the box, you may end up being untimely. Civil monetary penalties all of a sudden come in. So it's a 2+2+2 type process. You cannot just ask this question in its vacuum. You've got to think about what else has CMS built around this information, what's required, and if I don't do it, does my record get rejected? If that rejection doesn't get fixed, it never gets reported, and then do I become untimely? And now civil monetary penalties come. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me, but I do this stuff day in and day out. This is complicated stuff, and this is, this is an additional layer for folks to worry about. Again, the web is tightening these three obligations, and with the civil monetary penalties now becoming effective, this adds a higher degree of difficulty, I think, to getting this right.
Jim, that's your point all along, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Just looking at this issue from the standpoint of the plaintiff's attorney, I am concerned that if it is not done right, how is the claimant going to be affected? TPOC may never have been established on the claim. Medicare may continue making payments, and at some later date, say, oh, you got this settlement you didn't tell us about. Now we want some money back. And so it's going to require everybody working together to make sure that it is done right. I think that's the important piece there. Let's try to do it right. It won't be perfect no matter what we do, but let's at least pay attention to it and don't pretend that it doesn't apply to us for whatever reason.
Jim, that's such valuable thought, information there. In our practice of law, we have seen those examples where improper information, incorrect information has been reported. And then a year or 2 or 3 years later, it matters, it explodes. Medicare reacts to that. The claimant is now looking at thousands of dollars in conditional payments, all as a result of TPOC not having been reported accurately, or ICDs not reported accurately. All of a sudden, there were ramifications to that original act. There were ramifications and effects to that incorrect information, sometimes requiring the reopening of that workers' compensation case, sometimes doing away with that settlement that was had some years ago, sometimes with private causes of action claiming against whomever they think made the error, right? I think, Jim, you're right. We're about to enter a new world with this new requirement that will, as John, focused in more of this new mandatory insurer reporting component of things that maybe has been overlooked by, one side of the fence, if you will. So I think you guys are absolutely right that this is now a new focus for CMS, a new focus as a result for both sides of the fence.
Well, and guys, if you think about it from this perspective, this, in a lot of ways, is the simplest, most elegant solution to improve coordination of benefits for beneficiaries, right? It is not trying to jam a regulation down the throat of the industry. It is not creating set aside requirements, so to speak. This is data collection, reporting the data right, doing what you're supposed to be doing and have been doing all along should not be an issue for anybody. It's going to be a problem, though, for those folks who have not fully embraced the notion that the set aside concept applies to all workers' comp cases, particularly those involving a current Medicare beneficiary.
Where John, I can see a shift here, right, is wait a minute. I've had to report these cases that I'm settling over $750, right? You're telling me that even in cases where I may have settled it for less than that, there might be some requirement here, right? So all of a sudden, a question, right, for folks that could confuse them, right? Because we're not going to report any cases under 750 that we have to, but you can. It's a voluntary component of things, especially even in a small file like that. There are a few dollars set aside for an MSA, right? So the mental exercise, right, of how all of this fits with patterns of behavior that we have learned over the years, I think is going to be a challenge for folks. But as you've already indicated, we've got a year to educate folks. We've got a year to give them a little guidance and a little help and assistance in that regard.
So, guys, what do we think is going to happen to Medicare beneficiaries after this is implemented?
Well, most of them are not going to know anything about this, of course, until there's some adverse consequence down the road because it wasn't done properly. Their attorneys may be aware of what's going on, but didn't hit the radar that it needs to be interpreted and handled more efficiently than it has been in the past. But we know from past experience that at the end of the day, the injured worker is the one who can be adversely impacted the most. Loss of access to Medicare, just not doing it right can set up all kinds of problems for the individual. And that's why a renewed effort at figuring it out and doing it properly, I think, is very much in order.
Ralph, do you think there's a greater burden on the insurance industry or on the claimants bar with respect to this development going forward?
Certainly, John, from a reporting perspective, this is all a mandate on that employer carrier, the RRE, the primary payer, right? So the exercise of collecting the data, making sure, as we've already indicated, that number, there's validity behind it. There's a rational basis for that number. I think all of that and the reporting of it, it sits at that employer carrier RRE. But as Jim has indicated, right, the aftermath of all of this may hit that claimant, and it certainly does hit the claimant today directly, right? That there may be causes of action that will bring in that employer carrier later on, possibly. But immediately, the effect of all of this, as it leaves the door, as it gets reported and the case gets settled, the brunt of it, will be at that claimant's door.
So, guys, how about with respect to attorneys representing Medicare beneficiaries in a comp case? What's this mean for them? Does this mean that they need to get more proactive about this issue on behalf of the Medicare beneficiary?
I think so. They need to pay much closer attention. Within the last 2 weeks, there was a disbarment announced by an Ohio attorney for failing to, among other things, failing to acknowledge and pay conditional payment liens that were in existence. So I think that at the end of the day, the claimant's bar has to pay attention to the problems that not complying with this actually creates.
Ralph, what do you think about that?
I totally agree. I can't emphasize it more. Jim, I think is absolutely on the money on this, right? If in the past, especially in these cases that CMS wasn't looking at, right, the practice has been to just, out of thin air, pick a number and run, right? That practice has to come to a halt immediately, a stop. It means something now. That number has consequences. That reporting of that information lives beyond that date and will have great significance to CMS and to the claimant. You've built up a wall. If the claimant, cannot prove expenditures of up to that amount for then Medicare to turn into the primary payer, Houston, we have a problem, right? So Jim, I think you're absolutely right. If there ever was a time period here where the claimant bar needs to pay attention, get engaged, more involved, ask questions, maybe make that part of that mediation settlement report, this is it, right? This, I think, is a bell for all of us, for all of those folks that represent injured folks to get a little more engaged with this number.
Well,
What I've also, excuse me, John, what I've also found is that it's a call to action by the defense bar as well, because in litigation, workers' comp litigation in particular, in my experience, the parties generally work together. That we see the same lawyers over and over again. It's not a scorched earth policy in litigation in the comp world. So what we as defense lawyers could do by learning more about this is helping the mediators who are involved in this situation, helping the regulators who are dealing with these issues, and helping opposing counsel to understand where the pitfalls are and what could possibly be done to make it a better situation. It's another part of working together more completely and thoroughly to achieve the right result.
and guys, we know that CMS in the past has been taking steps through the Work Comp MSA reference guide to more actively involve the claimant's attorney in this process, right? They have inserted statements in that guide that say that claimants must consider Medicare's interests in all workers' comp cases. It now, as of a few years ago, on the consent of release form, obligates the attorneys to review the MSA and the evidence supporting the MSA, which is going to CMS for review, to be reviewed with the attorney and claimant and acknowledged in writing before it goes up for review, right? So there's been active steps by CMS. I know this will continue going forward to make sure that that side is engaged as much as the other side is engaged with respect to this process. I wanted to make sure we left a few minutes for questions, but also to provide our recommendations. So Ralph, why don't we run through our recommendations, then we'll hit some Q&A here, and then we'll wrap things up. Sound good?
Absolutely, right. And I think we've mentioned all of these already, right? Well, the threshold right now is 750. Got to do that. There is still no legal requirement to submit these workers' comp MSAs to CMS. They continue to be voluntary, but highly regarded by CMS, right? What I think we bring to the table today that may be new to a lot of the folks listening to us is you have to have a reasonable basis for that workers' comp MSA amount, right? If you did not submit that MSA to CMS for their review, there has to be extra special attention now paid to where did that number come from? How did you come up with that number that's going to get reported to CMS, right? And John, from a legal perspective, and we've been swimming in this little world for a while, right? We think this is about legal rights. That claimant, if he disagrees with Medicare's denial of benefits or request for reimbursement a year or 3 or 5 down the line, that claimant has the right to request redetermination, reconsideration, and go in front of an ALJ and present whatever the evidence was that documents why this number made sense at the time of settlement. So that's what all of us in our law firm are looking at, because we've started to get some of that already, which is, are we going to be able to prove in front of an administrative law judge or higher up where this number came from, why this number made sense, the rational basis why this number absolutely was the correct one at the time it settled. So for me, John, that's a shift of thinking. And I think it's going to become more of a legally based component where folks are going to challenge, right, what Medicare may maybe denying benefits down the line.
Yeah, Ralph, I think that's a really good point. This MSA data reporting mandate is going to mean that CMS on a go forward basis will now have MSA information for tens of thousands more Medicare beneficiaries on an annual basis than it does today. And for many of those, the MSA amount that is being reported may not have the sufficient evidence behind it or the rationale behind it to win the day. So there's going to be a need to marry the traditional medical MSA approach with a legally based rational analysis grounded in Medicare Secondary Payer Act and regulations and policy guidance and memos and reference guides from CMS, fully availing ourselves of the appeals process that, MSAs have not really gone down that road historically, but I certainly see that coming down the road at some point in time. And, you know, we know we've talked internally about that and the need to present credible substantive evidence behind what that proper MSA amount is going to look like if it ever is going to be challenged or benefits denied or pay and chase for future conditional payments.
Jim, is this the beginning of a Medicare appeals process for the employer carriers to be able to challenge CMS in some of these components?
It may very well be. I think we'll have to see how it evolves and what is actually done with the data and how it becomes more and more problematic. But I can see that being a very obvious step there in trying to get some of these things right. If you've got a case that's just a $5,000 denied case that you're settling or whatever, it's hard to calculate a realistic MSA out of that $5,000 settlement uh, without analyzing the law that applies to the case giving rise to the settlement. And therefore, uh, that may become a necessity to explain how the parties got to where they were. And it's going to have to come up with an appeal on the backside without a front side review.
That's a question, right? And I think we've been talking to CMS
Well,
about this for a long time. Certainly on the claimant side, that's already a view, right? Because it is an option for that claimant and his or her counsel. Whether it ever comes to the employer carrier side, I guess we'll see here.
First question that's I have in front of me here says this: if an insurer legitimately denies a condition, for example, the big toe, and the claimant chooses not to pursue that condition, but ends up settling the accepted condition, call it a back injury, what effect does the reporting have on the toe treatment in the future?
So the process that's in place now allows for an explanation of this issue already, right? That employer carrier will have accepted the compensability of the back, and that's the impairment that will be reported to CMS and the ICD-10 that's going to be reported to CMS. If there's no claim for the toe and there are no dollars being paid for the toe, and you could be as exact as actually saying that in the body of your settlement, so that only the low back is claimed and the low back is being settled, right? Everybody is compliant, everybody's doing the right thing. It's when maybe that toe was claimed, denied, and now being made part of the settlement, right? That Medicare says, if you're receiving dollars for something claimed that's now being released, guess what? That toe is a component of your TPOC. You had better report that toe also as part of the settlement. So more exactness, if you will, on the what's being claimed, what's being settled, so that we can report it accordingly, I think is the answer.
exactness can come from the proper use of the ICD-10 codes. So it's exactly clear what is part of the claim and what is not. Requires more diligence on the part of the parties to get that clarified and present it to the regulators or whoever approves the settlement.
Guys, a follow-up question here along those lines about the proper ICD codes. What is the best way to find the proper ICD codes and to limit the condition as much as possible?
Best source, of course, is CMS. On their website, they've got ICD all the way back to and the current ICD-10. So if you want to dive in, and there's a lot of them, and they are very exact, alphanumeric, allows for great detail. So if you truly want to go in, and you don't have to rely on those codes provided to you by the physician, the law allows for us, the payer in this particular claim, and certainly claimant's counsel, to ultimately come together and look at and decide on a code that may be different than that which the doctor may have used, so long as it is an honest description of with the injuries that have been related to the claim that have been compensable in the claim. So CMS warehouses them, CMS keeps them up and updates them. That's the best source for ICDs that I can think of and recommend to all of you out there.
I have to add to that though, Ralph, with the 60,000 plus ICD-10 codes out there, it's kind of difficult for someone who is not used to dealing with those to pick and choose properly. Keep in mind that there are professional organizations. I'm not going to call any names, but there are some specialized law firms that deal with that kind of thing that can help when presented with that problem.
Well, and Jim, I mean, the specificity matters, right? Getting the wrong one
Sure.
of those 60,000 plus codes wrong and reporting that to CMS could mean and open the door to larger conditional payments, larger counter hires from the WCRC, things like that, right? So that
Absolutely.
specificity really does matter when you get down to what the proper ICD-10 code is.
Absolutely.
Guys, how
We
about
get-
this? There's a question about TPOC that came in, Ralph.
Yeah.
What is included in the TPOC amount? I heard there was a change to require past payer payments.
No payments made for temporary total, temporary partial, ongoing impairment benefits, payments made for past medical care. None of that is part of the TPOC. TPOC is, as of this day, the agreed amount that we're talking about settlement of future indemnity and medical benefits related to the file that we have here at hand.
Yep.
So none of those that have been paid in the past are TPOC. Only those contemplated as part of the future settlement of the file.
Guys, here's a Massachusetts specific question. Let's see what we can do with this one, okay? Most work comp settlements in Massachusetts are done with liability, and payment of all related medical expenses remain with the work comp insurer. We have never had to submit those settlements to CMS, as there is no shifting of liability from the work comp insurer over to Medicare. Only those settlements done without liability have had to be submitted to CMS within the $25,000, $250,000 guidelines. Will that remain the case with these new requirements? Or will we need to submit all settlements, even those with liability remaining with the work comp insurer, to CMS?
If I understand it correctly, and we've had a couple of experiences with Massachusetts cases, right? Medicals generally are not closed. So the comp carrier or the self-insured employer remain liable and responsible for ongoing medical care associated with that workers' compensation claim. As a result, right, the only settlement to be had in Massachusetts are indemnity. Therefore, there is no settlement of those future medicals. Therefore, there is no need for a workers' comp MSA in those cases. Unless, of course, is a truly denied case. And as you've indicated here, you're settling the liability that includes all of it, including medical. In those situations, yes, of course, we would need to then submit to CMS as part of this new mandatory insurer reporting the value that's been provided to the workers' comp MSA as part of the overall settlement that you're reaching in the file.
Next question coming in. If the threshold for an MSA has just gone from 25K to 750, how is anyone staying in business?
So we've confused you, right? So the threshold has not changed from 25,000 to 750. Those are two different thresholds here. If you're thinking about a workers' comp MSA, and you're thinking about submission of that workers' comp MSA to CMS, 25,000 is the threshold if the claimant is a current Medicare beneficiary. 250,000 is the current threshold for review of that MSA if the claimant is not yet on Medicare, but may be within the next 30 months, right? Those are submission of the workers' comp MSA thresholds to CMS. That 750 is the reporting, not the submission of an MSA to CMS, but the actual reporting of the file over to CMS. You've got a current Medicare beneficiary, you're settling the case for more than $750, we have got to report all of the different data points over to Medicare. It has nothing to do with that Medicare set aside and the 25 or 250 threshold. That's only for submission of those MSAs over to CMS. How did I do on that, Jim?
I think you got it. I think you got it. And it's the total cost of the claim being $750, right? Not just you're not going to get anybody to approve a $750 settlement. It's just a total cost of the claim where the reporting threshold comes in.
If the settlement is over $750, right? In other words, if you have spent by way of settlement or you have spent in benefits more than $750, then now that reporting mechanism.
Right.
So let's say it's a file like in Massachusetts that you're not going to settle the medicals, right? But you've paid temporary total, temporary partial, you've paid medical care, all of that adds up to more than $750. Medicare wants you to report that file, and immediately what Medicare wants to know is, have you accepted ORM on that file? If so, tell me about the medical impairments. Tell me about the ICD-10s, right? So 750 is sort of the threshold that if that has been spent on the file, Medicare wants to know about this case. They want you to report it to them.
All right, Ralph, this is going to be a question that you with our MSA team deal with day in and day out when you're trying to collect the evidence necessary to support an argument for removal of a certain item from a set aside that's been previously approved, okay? Here's the question. We had an MSA of $95,000. The bulk of that was medication, and the most expensive medication was something the claimant had not taken in 3.5 years. I was able to get a document from the physician indicating that the doctor had not prescribed the medication in 3.5 years and won't be prescribing in the future. However, CMS, after the MSA being submitted 3 times, remained the same, and they insisted the meds stay on the MSA. Here's the question. Is there something else you can do to get that particular medication off of the MSA?
So there is, right? And that's showing Medicare, right, that based on the medical opinion at hand, and let's say that opinion came to us, a couple of months ago, showing Medicare that that is sort of the law of the case, showing Medicare by way of payout that after that medical opinion was rendered, right, the file has in fact lived under that new regimen of no medication here, right? So proving to Medicare that that is not just an opinion, but that is the fact of the case here, right? Oftentimes, those opinions are had immediately submitted to CMS, right? And CMS says, but wait a minute, part of the record indicates that it was used at one point, right? The question always is, right, is this the new mechanism, the new treatment guide, the new way that the doctor is in fact treating the patient, and then explaining to Medicare, if not that medication, then what else is that doctor doing to treat the patient and whatever the complaints or the ongoing problems are. So we have been very successful in doing that. It takes a little longer. It takes, a while to be able to prove to Medicare that that is the new way of treatment, that that is the new course of care for that particular claimant based on that physician.
Jim, let me throw the next question your direction, and then I'll ask Ralph for his thoughts as well. In a case of a fully denied claim where the facts of the case make it such that the claim is not a compensable workers' compensation accident, and the case is settled for simple nuisance value, yet a conditional payment letter exists for what amounts to the entire recovery for the client, what would you recommend in this situation? From my perspective, it makes it an impossible case to settle.
Well, it certainly can be an impossible case to settle. But what I would recommend in my experience is calling that firm of Cattie and Gonzalez and let Ralph work his magic on it. Because there are times that we can get those through, and there are times that we can come up with a solution there that works. We can get a zero MSA approved at the CMS. The problem is the conditional payments then are all coming from the BCRC, and they claim it's no longer a denied claim if you settle it, if you've actually paid some money to settle it. And so they are much more difficult to work with in trying to deal with that scenario. We do the best we can to try to make that thing turn around and get to an appropriate point of resolution. Ralph, do you have any other suggestions on how we'd walk away out of that one?
Jim, in keeping with what you just indicated, right, this is going to be a two-tier dance, if you will. First, we've got to go and address that conditional payment at the CRC, right? And if in fact it was a denied case, and more likely than not, we deal with the CRC prior to settlement, right? And we're able to produce evidence to the CRC that this is a condition and an accident not related to the claimant's employment. We win that on a regular basis. The CRC hears us, looks at the evidence, they shut down the conditional payment there. Then the case settles, and that employer carrier reports a TPOC over to Medicare. Well, we know that a settlement judgment award triggers Medicare's interest, right? So now that conditional payment, which was zipped out at the CRC, may move over to the BCRC. That's a tougher win there. That's a tougher argument to make. We're going to use the same evidence, right? We're going to use the same arguments. We're going to use the same legal aspects of the case that you defended the case on if you're the employer carrier to be able to convince the BCRC that this was a truly denied case and that the number of dollars the case is settling for has nothing to do with the merits of the actual injuries that may have been claimed in this case. We're going to work really hard at putting together a legal brief that outlines all of that, because without it, Medicare just does not believe, right, that the argument is valid. But with emphasis and evidence and explanation behind it, knock on wood, Jim, we've been lucky enough to be able to be successful in those components. Are we successful at 100% of them? We're not. There are cases that clearly the number of dollars that the case is settling for, Medicare, and maybe rightfully so, will not move off of the BCRC's request for that reimbursement. But in situations where the settlement amount allows us to, and we've got a rational basis from a legal perspective behind it, we're able to win the day.
The cases like that are always problematic is that it's a completely denied case, but we've settled it for only $1 million. They're not going to buy that. We have a hard time getting them to buy that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
That was a very large nuisance.
That's exactly right. If it's a $15,000 or $20,000 settlement, you have somewhat much better chance to work with it and explain that this really is a very expensive case, but it is denied and it's settled on a very nominal basis. And the arguments can prevail sometimes in those situations. But as you say, it's not 100%.
Here's the second to last question that we got, guys. Hypothetically, I have a client who is a current Medicare beneficiary. Can I settle that case for $24,999 and get away with it? If not, what figure is appropriate to avoid CMS involvement? Same question for a reasonable expectation within 30 months client, and we settle for $249,000. Who wants to tackle that one?
Jim, you've never seen this scenario before, have you?
I'm at the cases right now. Well, as we just explained, sometimes we can make those work. Sometimes we can. But it kind of depends on the overall circumstances of the case. And again, the higher the number, the more difficult it is to convince anybody that it's not a real claim. So there are some circumstances where you can get it through. Now, a settlement for $24,999 is below $25,000, but remember that that's a workload threshold. It is not an absolute safe harbor for anything below that. It's got to be handled properly, and that will require some appropriate analysis of the actual medical involved, legal issues involved, and so forth. Ralph, what do you add to that?
So want to make sure that we're being clear here, right? That 24,999 is only a threshold about submitting an MSA to CMS. So if you settle it at 24,999, Medicare, as of today, will not review your MSA, right? But does that mean that you have no other point of contact, point of contention with CMS? Absolutely not. Conditional payments, because this case is settling for more than $750, this case has to be reported to CMS and conditional payments must be reimbursed. So you may not have to send that MSA over to CMS for the review because of the 24,999, but you must definitely go and reimburse conditional payments, or at least figure out if Medicare made any payments, and if so, reimburse. Now here comes the new wrinkle that we have brought to you today, which is at 24,999, even though you didn't submit that MSA to CMS, come April 4th of 2025, this employer carrier, this RRE, will have to report whatever the self-allocation, whatever the actual MSA, whatever that number that has been allocated for future medical expenses, it will have to be reported to CMS come April 4th of 2025, right? So that's the new wrinkle here. So even though you may not have to send this MSA to CMS, or can't because it's less than 25,000, lots of other components of this equation that have Medicare interest to be had and interest to be resolved. So I do not think that you can get away, right, in this particular situation from not having to address those right there immediately, right, in front of you.
So, guys, maybe this begs the question, knowing that the effective date of the new MSA data reporting is April 4th of 25. Do you guys anticipate increased action, energy, efforts to resolve workers' comp claims involving current Medicare beneficiaries in advance of that April 4th, 25 date to try to not have to worry about that?
In my experience, I don't think that's what we will see. I think that the claims carry with them a life expectancy. And in today's claims environment, I don't recall a single situation where I've been presented with where we have to do this before this law changes relating to Medicare. I don't think it will happen that way. I think it's like all the other changes that have been announced by CMS. I think that it'll take a while for it to sink in universally across our entire industry to begin paying attention to those things. But I don't see a rush towards settlement to hopefully avoid a reporting.
I would agree with Jim, John. I don't think we're going to see a change in behavior in that regard. I think that the focus now will be, how do we prepare to do this, right? What's the basis behind that number, and what are we doing to make sure that there's a valid explanation behind that number?
Couple more questions here, guys. If my client is not Medicare eligible, can I settle a workers' comp case without worrying of CMS coming after us when my client eventually turns 67 and is required to go on Medicare?
Part of the question, the claimant will eventually go on Medicare at 67 or whatever it might be. Are you within a window there? Are you within the 30-month window of him actually becoming Medicare eligible? Or so I think there's more to that question that would have to be addressed to know whether or not there is any implication for the Medicare Secondary Payer Act.
If your claimant is not today age 65 or older and has not gone on Social Security disability and is getting Medicare today at an earlier age, right? If that's out, and there's no reasonable expectation, right? If he's older than 62 and a half and within the next 30 months, he'll become Medicare eligible, or if he's applied for disability, been denied, and he's in the appeals process. So if there's none of that here, you've got a 40-year-old who hasn't applied for disability. He is really far away from 65 and Medicare eligibility. Can I settle this file, not being afraid that there's going to be some Medicare component of it? Well, if this was a permanent total disability type case that everybody in the room knows, right? Catastrophically injured individual, as soon as he settles this file and he waits a month or two and he makes an application for disability, right? Even though he may not have met any of the components, anybody who would have looked at that factual pattern would have known this is a Medicare beneficiary if I've ever known one. You got to be really careful with that. But if we're talking about a 40-year-old with, minimal injuries, no application for disability, nothing that shows, that the reserves on the file were permanent total catastrophic type injuries, John, I think this is a good time to say you can settle the file and be at peace that Medicare is not going to, do something crazy down the line, like deny benefits down the line. What do you think about that?
Yeah, agreed with that. When we're talking about the three silos, there's no reporting to be done for non-Medicare beneficiaries at the time of settlement. There's no conditional payments. Obviously, you can't make a conditional payment unless the claimant's a Medicare beneficiary. So then it just gets down to the MSA question. And then depending on the facts, depending on the circumstances, the age, the application for disability, etc., perhaps there's something to be done there with respect to the MSA in a formal review and approval approach, a less formal approach, a legal approach. But depending on those circumstances, that MSA obligation is only one to be worried about at that point in time. Now, guys, just to clarify here, if they are not a Medicare beneficiary, nothing is reported, right? That's what we're talking about today?
If we have a claimant who is not a current Medicare beneficiary, then there is no mandatory reporting, right, that's expected or that's required. Therefore, there is no mandate, any required reporting of a workers' comp MSA and any of the 5 points that are now required and the 2 that may be voluntary. So the claimant has to be a current Medicare beneficiary for mandatory insurer reporting to apply to that individual.
Will a case settled now be reported and reviewed after the 4/24 reporting effective date? Which we know this was a typo. It's the 4/25 reporting effective date. Right, guys? So
Correct.
Case settled now, there's no, this won't come into play.
Nope. And this specific technical alert indicates that, right? That this will not be a requirement until after April 4th of 2025. So there will be no opportunity to report this information to CMS until, they bring it out as a test option. But even then, not formal, it will be a requirement beginning April 4th of 2025.
Okay.
Point of clarification, guys, the effective date of the new reporting requirement is April 5, 2025 instead of April 4. We were laughing earlier about why they chose that date when Monday would have been April 1st. But I think we were concerned that someone might have thought it was just an April Fool's joke to have the new reporting requirements dumped on them on that day. So, but it's April 5.
We may have to talk to CMS leadership about that, whether they actually thought about that. Like, wait a minute,
Wait a
April
minute.
doesn't sound cool, yeah?
All right, guys, assuming parties have agreement on settlement, not including any future medical care where liability or causation is disputed, will it make more sense to try the issue of future medical care with a work comp admin law judge with permanency aspects stipulated and let judge rule on relatedness of future medical care, assuming the ruling will be no liability for future care? Will that satisfy CMS?
Well, I can't speak to that. Ralph or John can address this better, but I can tell you that that was an approach that we would often take we would have a legitimate trial. If you get a judge to write an order for you that just says, yeah, it's not related, and it's not really a trial on the evidence, I don't think they would accept that. But a legitimate trial that has a finding of fact that these problems are not part of the claim is something that I think that we could successfully use.
You're absolutely right, Jim. Historically, and it's been made part of the reference guide, right? A trial, a tribunal, a workers' comp judge, an ALJ who looks at the evidence and the entirety of the submission of documents from both sides of the fence and who reviews all of that and renders an opinion, that is respected by CMS. And most oftentimes, we have been allowed to count on that as the basis for the argument here, right? If it is a stipulation, if it is a cursory review, in other words, if it's not a full-blown trial where evidence submitted and a judge has rendered a decision on the merits of the case, Medicare is not bound by that, and Medicare oftentimes rejects those stipulations as not being factually found by a competent judge in the jurisdiction in that particular state. So, Jim, I think you're absolutely right on.
If I have a client who has received $130,000 in off work and medical benefits, but these benefits were paid before a legitimate dispute arose, can I then settle the case for under the threshold and have no worry regarding CMS submission? In other words, do medical and off work benefits, no matter the amount paid, have any bearing on either the threshold or how CMS will view it? So this is getting more towards the review threshold again and not the threshold for this mandatory MSA data reporting, right?
Right, right. In the end, I mean, the answer to your question is yes, that's very permissible. That's very allowable, right? You have to have the facts and the evidence that indicate that, right? You have to have that notice of denial. You have to have a basis for that denial, right? Hopefully there is medical evidence to substantiate now that denial, right? All of that, right, would be part of the review process, at least, from our perspective, as to why we can then counsel a client to say, okay, to settle this file for $23,000 under the submission, considering that you've got medical documentation that now indicates none of these medical conditions that once were are now compensable based on the facts of the case. So we see that often. That's not an unusual circumstance, but you have to make sure you've got the right facts and the evidence to substantiate that point.
Yep. Facts and evidence matter at the end of the day. And it's going to become even more critical once the MSA data starts to flow through the TPOC reports to Medicare. Ralph, you might be in trouble here. This next comment's directed at you. To Mr. Gonzalez's hypothetical where a client applies for disability a few months after a settlement, how is that the attorney's fault if he is no longer a client? How can we protect ourselves? Send a letter to the client at the time of settlement, settlement contract language. All good ideas, right?
Yep, yep. I don't know that there's a way to protect yourself here, right? If somebody applies for Social Security disability after they've left your representation, and that claimant is denied benefits, right? Nothing to be worried about there. But if that claimant is awarded benefits, that is a clear bell, right? That the facts as you left them when you settled the file indicated eligibility for disability, which would have made this claimant eligible for Medicare, especially if there's a retroactive period of disability under the Social Security Administration. Those are facts that as a claimant representative, you must be significantly aware of. And if there's any merit to that application that you would think this claimant could meet eligibility, then the right thing to do is to take Medicare's interest at the time of that settlement, even though not on disability, even though not of age, taking Medicare's interest into account. So as you leave the file, a doing of a traditional medical MSA or a legal MSA, some sort of an opinion that establishes that as we left this file, we took Medicare's future interest, already thinking that perhaps this is a claimant who would otherwise meet the disability criteria. What do you think about that, John?
Yeah. Sounds right to me, Ralph. That, it's a concerning thing.
Yeah.
And it's not something we see with any sort of regularity happening to those attorneys who are in that position, right? But it's certainly, you have to be careful and cautious with respect to those certain fact patterns. And obviously, advising the client proactively and having these discussions and these what ifs conversations is what a prudent attorney will do in those situations.
John, in my days, I have lived through fact patterns like this one, right? A 55-year-old claimant with a second grade education who hasn't applied, right? But is now, as the residual functional capacity as a result of the injury is less than sedentary work. That's a claimant who I know if he applies, more likely than not, is going to get awarded disability benefits immediately. And if my date of accident was more than 2 years ago, he may enter Medicare eligibility immediately. As a representative of that claimant, I have to know those facts as I am now planning for settlement of this case. And I think I have to make plans for the possibility that he may leave me and apply for that benefit immediately or a year thereafter. So those are the kinds of things, John, you're right, fact specific, based on a case by case basis, but things that you've got to look at in order to make the right call.
So, guys, we're at the last question and successfully maneuvered around this one last question, but I've left it to the end because it warrants being addressed in this context. And that's the flip side of the work comp MSA, which is the liability MSA. Okay. Here's the question. Given the statutory language of the MSP Act, as well as published memorandums from CMS, have made clear that its post settlement interests need to be considered and protected within the liability context, why do you believe this reporting requirement was not extended into liability settlements as well? We knew we were going to get that question, right?
Yep.
Well, I think that it's perhaps a back door into it. You start reporting those, and then I think that there will be an analysis of the data down the road. But again, the whole intent of the new change is to collect data, and I can see them wanting to do something with that data at some point. Now, again, the new reporting is only on the comp case, but what about the comp case that's got a big liability claim attached to it? Those are the ones that I think that may become implicated by these developments.
John, we've talked about this a lot for a long time. Why has CMS advanced this concept in the comp world, but not in the liability arena? And from a structural perspective, the statute certainly mentions liability as it does workers' comp. There is a difference in the CFR. At least the ideology behind a Medicare set-aside is mentioned in 411, 46, and 47, right? The conceptual idea of allocating a certain number of dollars for future medical and having to spend that before you go to Medicare for it has been established in a code of federal regulations. That idea was not carried over into 41150s, which is the component for liability cases. So we do not have that conceptual framework within the body of the CFR. I don't know if that's the reasoning behind CMS's lack of direction and attention to the liability arena, right? The fact that they may not have ever been given at least the ideology from which to start thinking about futures in liability cases. At least I have often explained it in that regard, that there may be a lack of authority here in the liability, that CFR that exists in comp, that doesn't exist in liability, doesn't permit them to go to the next level. John, what do you think? I know that, we have spoken about this publicly before.
Yeah, the framework's not there with the specificity regarding future medicals in a liability insurance case as we have in the workers' comp insurance case. We do have 42 CFR 41150, which defines liability insurance in the context of the Medicare Secondary Payer Act. And we know that the published policy memos from CMS in the past have have looked to that regulation as justification for this concept. At the end of the day, this is data collection. It's not imposing any liability MSA requirements. What we have in front of us isn't imposing any additional workers' comp MSA requirements. For me, I feel like extending the TPOC data reporting to include work comp MSA information was the first natural extension in that direction. And over time, once the data is reviewed, CMS may make a decision to extend that to include liability, auto, and no fault, so that all 4 lines of insurance under the Medicare Secondary Payer Act are being reported for those future medical and MSA purposes. Again, merely for data collection, not creating any sort of liability MSA requirement, merely collecting data to improve coordination of benefits for Medicare beneficiaries. But that's a hot question amongst many people around the country.
Yeah, and it's one, John, that I think financially, super significant, right? If we're talking, $1 billion of MSAs worth on an annual basis that CMS gets to review, that number may be potentially 10 times that amount in the liability arena if it were ever to happen. So from a financial perspective to CMS and the effect that all of this would have on the trust fund and Medicare beneficiaries, all of us have been surprised that not more has been done, right? And the rationale behind it, whether it's the lack of a CFR or some other component, you're right. They could easily or as easily have gone down the liability road here because you're right. It's only a collection of information to determine how best to, activate these to measure the benefits.
At the end of the day, it is, for me, my personal opinion, the most simple and elegant solution to fully understand what's going on out there with respect to that particular issue, right? It doesn't necessarily involve creation and passage of a regulation. It does not necessarily mean you have to mobilize a new contractor or the WCRC to begin and launch a formal review process for liability MSAs. But collecting data about what's going on out there right now or post April of 25, and then seeing where the data leads you to certain conclusions, and then acting on that in a responsible way that makes sense. It would seem like at some point in time down the road that may happen. I don't know that we're there anytime soon, though. All right, guys, one last question, then we're going to wrap it up for the day. This just came in here. This has to do with plaintiffs providing Social Security numbers for queries and reporting purposes. Don't the liability reporting claims require the plaintiff's Social Security number? What happens if we refuse to provide it in settlements that are not in litigation?
And this happens often, right? Where a carrier in a liability claim does not have that claimant's Social Security number, and therefore the carrier cannot report this data over to CMS. As a matter of fact, that has been provided as one of the reasons why you may be excused from reporting and walking away from potential civil monetary penalties for untimely reporting if you don't have access to the information that's required in order to appropriately report. So this is an issue that CMS is aware of. They know it exists. They know it's a challenge, right? I will tell you that Medicare has other mechanisms, right? If they don't get it this way, they may eventually contact the claimant directly. They may eventually contact claimant's counsel directly, right? If Medicare can learn through the medical records a tie between the medical treatment and some other incident outside where there may be a primary payer, Medicare has been astute enough over the years to send a nice letter to the claimant to say, "Dear Mr. Claimant, we have recently learned that you may have had an accident 3 years ago, and your last medical note with your orthopedic indicates that case may have settled. Will you please share with us the following information?" And here it is, a long line of questions about that claim, that accident, those injuries, the doctors, the medical providers, everything that has happened as a result. So over the years, Medicare has met this issue before and has put together some components to be able to figure out and tie in all of that together, even if mandatory insurer reporting, was impossible because of not sharing that social security number.
Well, guys, they said it couldn't be done, but here we are at the last slide to wrap up this marathon session talking about MSA data reporting that's coming. Jim, any final thoughts to share with the attendees who have hung in here?
Well, I appreciate everybody's attention. I appreciate everybody's willingness to learn about this new development. I do think that some of what we can speculate on will eventually come to pass. Some of it may not. But we appreciate everyone's interest. We appreciate everyone taking the time to be with us this afternoon.
Raphael, how about you? And final
Same.
thoughts and comments?
Yeah, we're grateful to everybody that came to hear us today.
Really appreciate the time and attention today. Just to reiterate, this is our first quarterly webcast. We're going to be doing these every 3 months or so going forward. Best way to find out about these future sessions or any other Medicare secondary payer or lien resolution or MSA developments. If you are following us on social media, either individually, the attorneys here, or the firm Cattie Gonzalez on LinkedIn or Twitter/X, your best way to get real-time updates and information about these and other developments. So highly encourage you to give us a follow and like and share what we're doing and spread the word. So with that, I'm John Cattie. On behalf of Cattie Gonzalez, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.